At dawn in a quiet Melbourne suburb, a boy sits at a kitchen table with a book open like a shield. Outside, the world is loud with certainty. Flags, sermons, slogans, the easy confidence of people who think they already know who belongs and who doesn't. Inside, the boy is learning a different kind of power, the power of words that can outlast noise. He doesn't know it yet, but one day he will stand in rooms where a single sentence can stop a government, steady a nation, or shame the world. And he will do it with the same weapon he's holding now, language sharpened into law. His name is Ninian Stephen. Born on 15th of June 1923, he arrives in Australia between wars, in a country still defining itself by who it excludes. The Australia of his childhood is proud, anxious, and deeply British in its habits. An island continent that talks about fairness while building rules to keep others out. It's a place where the law can be both a promise and a trap. For Ninian, that contradiction becomes a lifelong obsession. How can a society claim justice and still practice discrimination? How can a court be impartial when the world outside it isn't? He grows up in Melbourne, in the long shadow of the Great Depression. Money is not something you assume will always be there. Security is not a given. The lesson is simple and brutal. If you want stability, you build it yourself. Through discipline, through study, through a reputation, so solid that even your enemies have to respect it. In school, he shows the kind of mind that doesn't just memorize facts, it interrogates them. He's drawn to arguments, to the architecture of reasoning, to the idea that truth can be tested rather than declared. Then the world catches fire again. The Second World War doesn't arrive as a distant headline. It presses into every household, every conversation, every future plan. Young men are swallowed by uniforms. Families learn to read telegrams with dread. The war is a countdown that no one can see, but everyone feels. For Ninian's generation, time itself becomes an adversary. You might not get the chance to become who you plan to be. He serves in the Australian Army. The experience is not romantic. It is structure, fatigue, obedience, and the constant awareness that life can be reduced to orders and consequences. War teaches him something that will later define his courtroom presence. Calm is not a personality trait. It's a survival skill. When fear is everywhere, the person who can think clearly becomes invaluable. He watches how institutions behave under pressure, how rules can either protect people or crush them, depending on who is holding the authority. The war doesn't make him cynical, it makes him precise. When peace returns, Australia tries to exhale. Men come home older than their years. The country wants normality, but normality has changed shape. Ninian returns to study with the intensity of someone who knows how quickly time can be stolen. He goes to the University of Melbourne and chooses law, not because it's glamorous, but because it's the engine room of power. Politicians can promise anything. Judges can force reality to match the promise. In lecture halls and libraries, he learns the traditions of common law, the careful rituals of precedent, the idea that justice is built case by case, brick by brick. He is called to the Victorian bar in 1950. The bar is its own world, competitive, hierarchical, suspicious of outsiders, and unforgiving of weakness. It's a place where your voice is your livelihood and your credibility is your currency. Ninian Stephen begins to build a reputation not as a showman, but as a craftsman. He prepares meticulously. He speaks with restraint. He doesn't waste words. In court, that kind of discipline can feel like a threat because it signals control. And control in a legal battle is contagious. In 1952, he marries Kathy Stephen, and the partnership becomes one of the quiet anchors of his life. The public will later see him in robes and formal settings, but behind that image is a man who understands that endurance is personal before it is professional. The law demands long hours, constant pressure, and the ability to absorb conflict without letting it corrode you. A stable home life doesn't make the battles easier, but it makes them survivable. As the 1950s turn into the 1960s, Australia begins to shift. The old certainties start to crack. The country's relationship with Britain loosens. Immigration changes the face of cities. The White Australia policy, once spoken of as common sense, starts to look like a moral stain. Indigenous Australians push against a system designed to ignore them. The world is watching decolonization, civil rights movements, and the rise of international human rights language. The law is no longer just about contracts and crimes. It's about identity, belonging, and the legitimacy of the state itself. Ninian Stephen is not a street activist. He is not a man who shouts. His arena is different. Committees, courtrooms, the slow machinery where decisions become binding. He becomes involved in public service and legal reform work, including roles connected to law reform in Victoria. It's the kind of work that rarely makes headlines, but it shapes the rules that will later decide real lives. He learns how to navigate bureaucracy without becoming its prisoner. He learns how to argue for change in a language that institutions can't dismiss. And then comes the first major turn: politics. In 1970, he enters the Australian Senate as a Liberal senator for Victoria. For a barrister and judge-in-waiting, it's a risky move. Politics is messy, it's tribal. It rewards performance and punishes nuance. The Senate is not a courtroom. It's a battlefield of microphones, party discipline, and public perception. But Stephen steps into it with a lawyer's instinct. If you want to influence the rules, sometimes you have to sit where the rules are written. The timing is brutal. Australia is heading toward one of the most volatile political periods in its modern history. The early 1970s are charged with ideological conflict, Vietnam, social change, economic uncertainty, and a growing sense that the old order is either collapsing or being challenged into something new. In Parliament, Stephen is not the loudest voice, but he is the kind of voice that makes people pause. He brings legal clarity to political arguments. He understands that a careless phrase can become a constitutional crisis. And then in 1972, the Whitlam government comes to power, and the temperature rises. Reform accelerates. Opposition hardens. The Senate becomes a pressure cooker. Stephen is in the middle of it, watching how quickly democratic institutions can be pushed to their limits. This is not abstract theory anymore. This is the system itself, tested, strained, and daring someone to blink first. Here's the uncomfortable truth that begins to emerge. The law is not a neutral machine. It is operated by humans, and humans have ambitions, fears, and loyalties. Stephen sees how power can be used to block, to delay, to punish, to force outcomes without ever admitting that force is being used. He also sees something else: how fragile legitimacy is. A government can have numbers and still lose trust. A parliament can follow procedure and still ignite outrage. The rules can be obeyed, and the country can still feel like it's breaking. In 1975, the crisis detonates. Australia is plunged into the constitutional confrontation that will scar its political memory. The dismissal of Prime Minister Gough, Whitlam by Governor-General Sir John Kerr. It is the kind of event that makes people question the foundations beneath their feet. In the aftermath, emotions are raw, and the nation is split between those who see a necessary intervention and those who see a democratic betrayal. In that storm, Ninian Stephen is appointed a judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria in 1975. The shift is dramatic, from the partisan heat of the Senate to the disciplined silence of the bench. It's also a pivot that reveals something essential about him. He is not addicted to politics. He is drawn to the place where decisions must be justified, not merely won. On the bench, you can't hide behind party lines. You have to explain yourself. You have to be accountable to reason. But the timing again is merciless. Australia is still shaking from the dismissal. Trust in institutions is bruised. Every legal decision feels like it carries political weight, whether it intends to or not. Stephen steps into judicial office with a reputation already formed: intelligent, careful, principled, and with the knowledge that the eerie country is watching its judges differently now. People want certainty. They want reassurance that the system isn't just a game for elites. He brings to the Supreme Court a temperament forged by war, sharpened by advocacy, and tested by politics. He is not theatrical. He is methodical. He listens. He writes with clarity. And he understands that the authority of a judge is not in volume, but in credibility. In a society that is beginning to argue about everything, race, rights, power, identity, the judge who can explain the law without inflaming, the crowd becomes a stabilizing force. Yet even as he settles into the role, another clock is already ticking. The legal world is not a gentle ladder. It's a series of doors that open briefly and then close. Opportunities come with deadlines. Appointments depend on timing, reputation, and the unpredictable currents of politics. Stephen has stepped away from Parliament, but politics has not stepped away from him. In Australia, the highest courts are never entirely insulated from the nation's storms. By the late 1970s, his name is circulating beyond Victoria. He is seen as a jurist with national stature, someone who can handle complexity without ego, someone who can carry the weight of controversial questions without turning them into personal crusades. The country is moving toward new legal battles about federal power, about rights, about Australia's place in the world. And in the background, the international human rights movement is gaining force, creating a new kind of moral pressure on domestic law. Ninian Stephen is about to be pulled into that larger arena. The quiet boy with the book, the soldier who learned calm under threat, the barrister who built arguments like machines, the senator who watched a nation's constitution convulse. He is approaching the point where his decisions will no longer affect just one courtroom or one state, but the entire country. And the most dangerous part is this. The closer you get to the highest bench, the less room you have for mistakes. One misjudgment can define you. One controversial ruling can turn you into a symbol, either of justice or of everything people fear about the system. Stephen is stepping toward a role where the conflict is no longer between two parties in a case, but between the law and the nation. As expectations of what the law should be, the next door is already in sight. And when it opens, it won't be a gentle promotion. It will be a test of intellect, of restraint, and of whether a man can hold the line when the country itself is pulling it apart. The door opens and the air changes. In politics, you can survive on applause. In a courtroom, applause is irrelevant. On the bench, there is only the record. Cold, permanent, and merciless. Ninian Stephen has just stepped into a world where every sentence he writes can be used like a weapon years later by people he will never meet in battles he cannot predict. And the timing could not be worse. Australia is still raw from the Whitlam dismissal, suspicious of authority, hungry for certainty. Socrates and ready to turn judges into villains the moment a decision feels wrong. He begins as a judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria in 1975, and the shift is almost cinematic, from the Senate's noise to the bench's controlled silence. But silence doesn't mean safety. It means pressure without release. A judge can't campaign, can't explain himself on television, can't trade barbs in Parliament. He must speak through reasons, through judgments that have to stand up when the emotion of the day has faded. Stephen's conflict now is not with a political opponent. It's with something more dangerous. The public's demand for simple answers in a country that has become complicated. The law is expected to be a straight line. Real life is a knot. And every time he unties one knot, someone will accuse him of cutting the rope. He works with the habits that made him formidable at the bar. Meticulous preparation, restraint, a refusal to perform. In court, that restraint can feel like ice, but it's not coldness, it's discipline. He listens as if the outcome depends on it, because it does. He writes as if every word will be challenged, because it will. And slowly, in a legal culture that can be suspicious of anyone who looks too careful, he becomes known for something rare, a mind that can carry complexity without showing off. Then in 1979, the next door swings open, bigger, brighter, and far more dangerous. He is appointed to the High Court of Australia. For most lawyers, that's the summit. For Stephen, it's the start of a new kind of exposure. The High Court is not just another court. It is the place where the country's arguments about itself become law. Federal power, state power, individual rights. The meaning of the Constitution, the limits of government, the boundaries of fairness. When the High Court speaks, the nation rearranges itself around the words, and Stephen arrives at a moment when Australia is changing its skin. The old assumptions about race, about immigration, about indigenous people, about the country's relationship to Britain, are being challenged in public and in private. International human rights language is seeping into domestic debates. People are beginning to ask whether legal and just are always the same thing. That question is dynamite in a courtroom. Here's the hook that makes his story sharper. Stephen is not a revolutionary judge, and he is not a reactionary one either. He is something harder to categorize, and therefore easier to attack. He is a jurist who takes rights seriously, who is attentive to international law and human rights principles, and who believes that legal reasoning must be honest about moral consequences. In a country where many still want judges to be invisible technicians, that stance can look like provocation. The High Court years are not a single dramatic showdown. They are a series of high-stakes collisions, each one leaving a mark. Cases arrive that force the court to weigh individual liberty against state power, fairness against procedure, tradition against a society that no longer fits the old templates. Stephen's opinions, careful, reasoned, often attentive to broader principles, help shape the court's direction in an era when Australians are increasingly aware that law is not just about rules, but about who gets protected by them. And while he is doing this, another clock is ticking, one that doesn't care about reputation or intellect. In Australia, High Court appointments are not for life. There is a mandatory retirement age. Time is built into the job like a fuse. Stephen can see the end date. He can count the years. Every term matters. Every judgment is part of a finite body of work. The pressure is subtle but relentless. You don't have forever to get it right. Then comes the twist that changes the scale of his life. In 1982, while still a justice of the High Court, Stephen is appointed Governor General of Australia. It's hard to overstate how strange that is. A sitting High Court judge, someone trained to avoid politics, suddenly becomes the Queen's representative, the constitutional figurehead. In the person who signs laws, dissolves Parliament, and stands at the symbolic center of the system that had nearly torn itself apart in 1975. The office is haunted by the memory of Sir John Kerr. The country has not forgotten. The role is not ceremonial in the way people like to pretend. It is ceremonial until the day it isn't. And then it can decide the fate of governments. Stephen steps into Government House carrying an invisible burden. The public's fear that the Governor General might again become the trigger for a constitutional explosion. He cannot erase the past. He can only behave in a way that makes another crisis less likely. And now the conflict becomes intensely personal. He must be visible without being political, authoritative without being partisan, dignified without being distant. Every gesture is interpreted. Every silence is analyzed. Every public appearance is weighed for hidden meaning. If he missteps, he doesn't just damage himself. He damages the office and possibly the country's trust in its own constitutional machinery. He approaches the role like a judge approaches a hard case, with caution, with respect for boundaries, and with an almost stubborn commitment to propriety. He and his wife Kathy become a steady presence. Formal, yes, but not theatrical. He is not trying to be loved. He is trying to be trusted. And then, almost immediately, he is tested. The early 1980s are not calm. Australia is wrestling with economic strain, political change, and the aftershocks of social transformation. The Fraser government is nearing its end. The Labour Party under Bob Hawke is rising. The country is shifting again, and shifts create friction. In that environment, the Governor General's job is to be the constitutional shock absorber, to keep the system from rattling itself apart. Stephen's legal mind becomes his survival kit. He understands, in a way few can, how quickly a constitutional question can turn into a legitimacy crisis. He knows that the Governor General's reserve powers, those shadowy, rarely used authorities, are like matches in a dry forest. You don't play with them. You don't even let people think you might. So he does something that sounds simple but is brutally hard. He makes the office boring again. Predictable, proper, unexciting. In a democracy still traumatized by drama, that is a form of repair. But boredom doesn't mean ease. Behind the scenes, the schedule is punishing. The role is a conveyor belt of obligations. Ceremonies, speeches, meetings, travel, endless public scrutiny. The Governor General is expected to be everywhere, to represent everyone, to offend no one, to embody unity in a country that argues as a national sport. And Stephen is doing it with the knowledge that his time is limited. His term will end, and what remains will be the public memory of whether he steadied the office or weakened it. He also carries another tension, one that doesn't show in photographs. Stephen is a man of law and conscience in a role that demands neutrality. He cannot publicly campaign for causes the way others can. He cannot speak freely on political controversies. Yet he is living in a world where moral questions are pressing harder. Indigenous recognition, immigration, Australia's responsibilities beyond its shores. He must hold his tongue even when his mind is loud. That restraint becomes part of his identity. Some admire it as statesmanship. Others see it as distance. But the deeper truth is that restraint is his method of preventing the office from becoming a battlefield again. He is fighting, quietly, against the gravitational pull of crisis. And then in 1983, the system changes hands. Bob Hawke becomes prime minister. The transition is a moment when constitutional roles can become delicate, when the choreography of democracy must be flawless, because any stumble becomes a story. Stephen presides over it with the calm of someone who has seen institutions under stress and refuses to add heat. Year by year, he builds something that cannot be legislated, a renewed sense that the Governor General can be a stabilizing presence rather than a threat. It's not glamorous work, it's reputational work. It's the slow rebuilding of trust, brick by brick, in a country that had watched trust shatter. By 1989, his term as Governor General ends. He leaves the role having done what few notice until it's gone. He has lowered the national temperature. He has made the office less frightening. He has shown that constitutional power can be held without hunger. But the story doesn't settle into retirement, because Stephen is not the kind of man who steps away from responsibility and disappears. As he walks out of Government House, another arena is already waiting, larger than Australia, harsher than domestic politics, and filled with conflicts where law is not just debated, but violated in blood. The skills that made him a steady Governor General, precision, restraint, moral seriousness, are about to be tested in places where restraint can look like weakness and moral seriousness can make you enemies. He has spent years proving he can keep a nation's constitutional machinery from overheating. Now the world is going to ask him to do something even harder, to bring law into spaces where power has learned to live without it. The first shock is how quickly the world stops caring that you were Governor General. In Canberra, doors open because of your title. In the international arena, doors open only if you can carry a message into a room full of men with guns and still walk out with the truth intact. Ninian Stephen steps out of Government House in 1989 with a reputation for steadiness and almost immediately finds himself in a landscape where steadiness is not admired. It is tested, it is hunted. Because the late 20th century is not a polite era. It is an era of collapsing regimes, ethnic hatred, proxy wars, and governments that learn to smile for cameras while doing terrible things off screen. And the world is beginning to demand something it has always struggled to enforce: accountability. Stephen's new work is not about ceremony. It is about evidence. It is about names, dates, chains of command. It is about the kind of facts that make people deny, threaten, and destroy. He becomes, again and again, the man sent in when the problem is too politically toxic for ordinary diplomacy. The skill set that once made him a careful judge, listening without flinching, writing with precision, refusing to be seduced by slogans, now becomes a survival tool. But it also becomes a target. Because in international conflicts, neutrality is often interpreted as hostility by everyone at once. One of the most defining arenas is Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge years have left a wound so deep it feels unreal. A country where the ground itself seems to remember. Nearly 2 million people dead. A society dismantled. Families erased. The world knows the headline version, killing fields. But the reality is more intimate and more horrifying. Teachers executed for wearing glasses, children turned into informants, starvation used like policy, torture turned into routine administration. And after the killing, there is the second crime, the attempt to bury memory under politics. Stephen becomes involved in the long, grinding international effort to move Cambodia toward peace and a lawful future. This is not a single dramatic negotiation. It is a maze of factions, foreign interests, and exhausted civilians who have learned not to trust promises. The United Nations is trying to do something almost impossible: supervise a transition in a country where the very idea of neutral authority has been poisoned. Here the conflict is not a courtroom argument. It is the collision between law and raw power. Stephen's instincts, be careful, be precise, be fair, are exactly what the situation needs. They are also exactly what impatient actors hate, because precision slows down propaganda. Fairness blocks shortcuts. And in post-conflict politics, shortcuts are how people keep their influence. He is asked to help design and defend processes that can hold when everyone is tempted to cheat. Elections, institutions, human rights protections. The boring scaffolding of a state, except in Cambodia. Scaffolding is the difference between a fragile peace and a return to terror. And there is a clock on him now that is harsher than any retirement age. He is not a young man. He is in his late 60s, then 70s, flying long distances, walking into tense rooms, reading reports that would make most people physically ill and still expected to be lucid, diplomatic, and unbreakable. The time limit is not written in law anymore. It is written in the body. Jet lag, fatigue, the sheer weight of what he is asked to absorb. Every mission carries the unspoken question, how many more times can you do this? Then comes another front, the global environment. To some, environmental policy sounds soft compared to war crimes and political violence. Stephen learns quickly that it can be just as vicious, because it threatens money, and money hires better lawyers than ideology does. He becomes deeply involved in international environmental law and governance, including leadership roles connected to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The stakes are planetary, but the battles are personal. Industries, governments, and lobbyists fighting to delay, dilute, and deny. And Stephen, who has spent his life treating evidence as sacred, finds himself facing a new kind of opponent. Organized doubt. Not honest disagreement, but manufactured uncertainty. The tactic is simple and brutal. If you can keep the public confused, you can keep the status quo profitable. He pushes for the idea that environmental harm is not an abstract future problem. It is a present injustice. It hits the poor first. It hits indigenous communities first. It hits those with the least political leverage. In other words, it is a human rights issue wearing a different mask. That framing is dangerous because it links two worlds that powerful people prefer to keep separate. If environmental destruction is merely development, it can be negotiated away. If it is injustice, it demands accountability. Stephen's voice carries weight because it is not theatrical. He does not sound like a campaigner. He sounds like a judge reading the record. And that tone, calm, precise, unpanicked, can be more unsettling than anger. Anger can be dismissed as emotion. Calm facts are harder to swat away. But the most intense moral pressure of his post-Governor General life arrives through human rights investigations and the machinery of international justice. Stephen becomes associated with the United Nations in roles that require something rare, the ability to look at atrocity without turning it into spectacle and to write findings that can survive political attack. This is where his high court discipline returns in a new form. In domestic law, you worry about appeals. In international law, you worry about something worse, that your report will be used as a weapon by one side, ignored by another, and quietly buried by those who fear its consequences. He is repeatedly placed in positions where he must insist on standards, due process, credible evidence, careful language, while knowing that the world often wants a simpler story, heroes and villains, quick condemnation, quick absolution. Stephen refuses that. He knows that if you get the facts wrong, you don't just make a mistake. You hand the guilty a shield. And then comes the twist that makes his whole career feel like it has been building toward one theme. The law is only as strong as the courage to apply it. Because Stephen is not operating in a vacuum. He is operating in a world where powerful states can pressure international bodies, where funding can be threatened, where access can be denied, where cooperation can be offered only if conclusions are softened. The conflict becomes a familiar one, but on a global scale, principle versus convenience. There are moments when the pressure is not subtle, when the message is essentially, be reasonable, be pragmatic, don't inflame tensions, don't embarrass anyone, don't make it harder for diplomacy. And Stephen's answer, again and again, is that diplomacy without truth is just delay. It is the postponement of accountability until the victims are too old, too tired, or too dead to matter. This is where his restraint becomes something else. Not just caution, but moral stamina. The ability to keep speaking in measured sentences when the subject matter is screaming. He also becomes, increasingly, a bridge between Australia and the world's evolving legal conscience. He is part of the generation that helps normalize the idea that international law is not decorative, that human rights are not optional, that sovereignty is not a license. And yet for all the global work, there is a quiet, almost cinematic irony. The man who once had to make the governor generalship boring now spends his later years in roles where boredom would be a luxury. He is drawn toward the places where systems are breaking, where institutions are distrusted, where the rule of law is more aspiration than reality. The tension keeps rising because the older he gets, the more the missions demand from him. He is asked to chair, to advise, to mediate, to investigate, always with the expectation that his name will lend credibility. But credibility is not a medal you wear. It is a debt you must keep paying. Every time he accepts a role, he risks it. One misjudgment, one careless phrase, one perceived bias, and decades of trust can fracture. And he knows it. So he works the way he always has, by refusing to rush, by reading everything, by asking the uncomfortable question twice, by writing conclusions that are narrow enough to be defensible and strong enough to matter. It is not glamorous. It is not viral. It is the slow craft of making truth usable. There is also a personal cost that rarely makes it into public biographies. The accumulation of horror, the reports, the testimonies, the photographs you cannot unsee, the knowledge that for many victims, justice will come late or not at all. Stephen is not a man given to public confession, but you can feel in the seriousness of his later work that he understands the weight of what he is handling. And still he keeps going. Because the deeper hook of his life is this: he keeps choosing the harder room. He could have lived comfortably on honors and speeches. Instead, he repeatedly steps into contested spaces where his presence will be resented by someone powerful. He becomes, in effect, a specialist in legitimacy, called in when institutions need a face that people might believe. By the time he is well into his 70s and 80s, the pattern is unmistakable. The same man who once navigated Australia's constitutional trauma now navigates the world's moral fractures. The same discipline that kept him from inflaming domestic politics now keeps him from being manipulated by international ones. The same insistence on careful reasoning becomes a form of resistance. And the time limit tightens, not because he announces retirement, but because age is relentless. The travel becomes harder. The pace becomes punishing. The world does not slow down to match an elder statesman's stamina. Conflicts keep erupting. Environmental alarms keep sounding. Human rights crises keep multiplying. There is always another urgent request, another committee, another mission that needs his credibility. The question becomes unavoidable. How do you decide which fires to run toward when you can't run forever? Stephen's answer, in practice, is to keep choosing the ones where law can still make a difference, where a report can still shape policy, where a standard can still be set, where a process can still be built that outlasts the personalities of the moment. And that is the real achievement of these years. Not a single headline, but a body of work that treats law as a living tool, not a museum piece. He helps push the idea that justice is not only national, that the environment is not only scientific, that human rights are not only rhetorical. He is, in the most literal sense, extending the jurisdiction of conscience. But even as he does, the story is setting up its final turn. Because the later a life goes, the more it becomes about what remains when the roles end, when the titles fall away, when the world stops calling, when the body finally insists on rest. And for Ninian Stephen, the last act is not about one more appointment. It's about whether the steadiness he practiced, under pressure, under scrutiny, under the weight of other people's suffering, actually changed anything that can survive him. The second shock is how quietly the world starts to hand you your own ending. Not with a scandal, not with a dramatic resignation, with a calendar that fills a little less each year, with flights you stop taking, with invitations that arrive and then, one day, done it. For a man who has spent decades being summoned when things are breaking, the most unsettling sound is silence. And yet Ninian Stephen doesn't vanish. He simply changes the way he fights. In his 80s, the urgency is no longer only political. It is biological. The time limit that used to be an abstraction, later, eventually, when I retire, becomes a daily physical negotiation. Energy is finite. Recovery takes longer. The mind remains sharp, but the body begins to invoice you for every mile you ever flew, every late night you ever spent reading documents that smelled of smoke and blood and bureaucracy. He keeps working anyway, but with a different geometry, less sprinting into crisis zones, more building the scaffolding that might keep the next crisis from happening, or at least keep it from being forgotten. He lends his name and his discipline to institutions that depend on credibility, the way a bridge depends on bolts. He continues to speak, to advise, to chair, to write. Not because he needs the stage, but because he knows what happens when careful voices leave the room. The loudest people start rewriting the record. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that role. You are valued not for warmth, not for charisma, but for the fact that others believe you will not lie, that you will not bend, that you will not turn suffering into a slogan. It is a compliment that can feel like a sentence, and the world around him is changing faster than any judge's instincts were designed for. The international order that once seemed to be hardening, human rights norms, environmental commitments, the slow construction of accountability, begins to wobble under new pressures. Cynicism becomes fashionable again. Strongman politics returns with a grin. Facts become negotiable. The very idea of expertise is treated as elitism. Stephen, who built his life on the premise that evidence matters, watches a new era learn to treat evidence as just another tribe's opinion. This is where the conflict of his final years sharpens into something almost cruel. He has spent a lifetime strengthening the rule of law, and now he must watch the rule of law be mocked as weakness. He does not respond with theatrics. He responds the way he always has, by insisting on standards, by refusing to let language slide, by reminding audiences in that measured cadence that rights are not gifts from governments, they are limits on governments, that courts are not ornaments, they are breaks, that the environment is not a nice to have, it is the operating system of human life. But there is a twist here that most people miss. The older he gets, the less his authority comes from office, and the more it comes from something harder to manufacture: moral consistency over time. Anyone can sound principled for a season. Stephen has sounded principled for decades across different arenas, different political winds, different temptations. That consistency becomes its own kind of power, and it also becomes its own kind of threat. Because if a man like that says calmly that something is wrong, you can't easily dismiss him as partisan. You have to either answer him or try to erase him. So the attacks, when they come, are rarely direct. They are the modern kind: indifference, minimization, the slow attempt to make seriousness look old-fashioned. The world doesn't always argue with you. Sometimes it simply scrolls past you. And still he keeps choosing the harder room. Only now the harder room is often a lecture hall, a board meeting, a policy forum where the stakes are hidden behind polite language, where development can mean displacement, where security can mean torture, where economic growth can mean a river that no longer has fish, a coastline that no longer holds, a community that no longer exists. He speaks about the environment with the same gravity he once brought to constitutional law, because he understands something that is still shocking when you say it out loud. Environmental collapse is not only a scientific forecast. It is a legal and moral failure unfolding in real time. It is the slow violence that doesn't look like violence until the hospital fills, the crops fail, the fires arrive, the water turns brackish, and the poor are told politely that this is the price of progress. He has seen what happens when the world waits too long to name a crime. Cambodia taught him that. Human rights investigations taught him that. Delay is not neutral. Delay is a side, and yet for all his public seriousness, the private life continues, quietly, stubbornly, like a second narrative running under the first. He is not only a former governor general, not only a former high court justice, not only an international envoy. He is a husband, a father, a man with routines and loyalties that do not make headlines. His marriage to Kathleen Stephen is one of the steady facts of his life, a partnership that outlasts offices and crises. The public sees the formal photographs. The private reality is the long companionship behind them, the shared endurance of a life that keeps being interrupted by duty. As the years advance, the interruptions become fewer, but the weight of memory becomes heavier. There is a particular burden carried by people who have read too many reports. You remember names that the world never learned. You remember villages that were burned and then rebuilt and then burned again. You remember the way officials can speak about incidents when they mean bodies. Stephen does not turn that into performance. He does not monetize it as trauma. He carries it the way he carried everything, with restraint. But restraint is not the same as numbness. If anything, restraint is what allows him to keep functioning without breaking. And then, inevitably, the story begins to narrow. Not because his mind narrows, but because life does. The circle of contemporaries thins. The era that shaped him, wartime childhood, post-war rebuilding, the long argument over what law is for, starts to feel like a foreign country to younger Australians. He becomes, in the eyes of some, a figure from a civics textbook. Dignified, distant, safely historical. That is the danger of a life like his. The danger is that people remember the titles and forget the tension. They forget that he lived through a constitutional crisis where every word mattered and every misstep could have torn the country's fabric. They forget that he spent years in international work where a poorly chosen phrase could endanger lives, derail fragile peace, or hand propagandists a gift. They forget that neutrality in such rooms is not comfort. It is exposure. Everyone wants you to be on their side. If you refuse, both sides suspect you. They also forget the simplest, most human pressure, the clock. Because the clock is not only about mortality, it is about relevance, about whether the work you did will be used or shelved, about whether the standards you fought for will be applied or treated as quaint, about whether the next generation will inherit tools or only stories. Stephen's later years are, in that sense, a race against forgetting. He continues to be honored. Knighthood, awards, formal recognition. But honors are not what he is chasing. He has had enough of those to know they do not stop a massacre, do not cool a planet, do not protect a witness. What matters is whether institutions keep their spine when the pressure comes. And pressure does come. The world enters the 21st century with new wars, new disinformation, new forms of political cruelty that wear modern clothes. The temptation to trade rights for fear returns, as it always does. The temptation to treat refugees as numbers returns. The temptation to treat the environment as a bargaining chip returns. Stephen watches these cycles with the weary clarity of someone who has seen how quickly temporary measures become permanent habits. He does not pretend that law alone can save us. He is too experienced for that. But he insists, quietly, relentlessly, that without law we are left with power, and power does not apologize. In the end, the final turn of his story is not a single event. It is the way his life resolves into a pattern. A boy from Melbourne who learned discipline early. A lawyer who treated words as instruments, not decorations. A judge who believed that fairness is not softness, but structure. A governor-general who steadied a country by refusing to inflame it. An international figure who carried the same steadiness into rooms where steadiness could get you hated. And then at last, a man who grows old in a world that keeps demanding urgency. On 29 October 2017, Ninian Stephen dies at the age of 94. The news is respectful, formal, almost understated, fitting for him. There is no global siren, no cinematic montage, just the quiet fact that a particular kind of public servant is now gone. But if you look closely, the legacy is not quiet at all. It is in the expectation, now embedded in Australian public life, that the Governor-General should be above partisan heat, that the office should calm rather than provoke. It is in the legal culture that values careful reasoning over rhetorical victory. It is in the international habit, still fragile but real, of sending investigators, writing reports, building tribunals, insisting that atrocities are not merely tragedies but acts with perpetrators. It is also in the environmental framing he helped strengthen, that the planet is not a backdrop to human drama, but a participant, and that destroying it is not only foolish but unjust. And there is one more image that lingers, the one that makes his entire biography feel like a single, continuous decision. Picture an elderly man, suit slightly looser now, hair white, posture still straight, walking into yet another room where people want him to bless their version of events. He does not raise his voice. He does not threaten. He does not perform outrage. He asks for the record. He asks for the evidence. He asks the question that powerful people hate because it cannot be bribed. What actually happened? That is the steadiness he practiced until the end. Not the steadiness of someone who avoids conflict, but the steadiness of someone who walks into conflict and refuses to let it corrupt the truth. And if you want the real reason to remember Ninian Stephen, it is this. In a century that rewarded noise, he proved that quiet integrity can still move history, slowly, stubbornly, and at a cost.